Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just did a little bit of an SEC Media Day update. A ton of stuff happened out in Dallas, and we might have to unpack a little bit more of it as we get throughout the show. We definitely have one segment right after this that will unpack a big topic of conversation over there, but let's get into a big time thing that is happening kind of behind the scenes right now, but could be coming in front of the scenes very, very quickly here pretty soon. Charlie Baker, the NCAA president, and someone that has been a big topic of conversation for quite some time. Apologize for that lower third. He is someone that has a ton of power in the sport. He is someone that absolutely dictates a ton of things that happen in terms of structure, in terms of the way that they're going to police things. All of this stuff kind of goes through this guy. And it's created kind of an interesting situation for a lot of these sports where there's kind of a confusion of what the structure is for specific sports, at least from my perspective. I think there's a lot of confusion of who's in charge of specific sports and how can they fully be in charge if they're not hyper focused on it. So someone like Charlie Baker, who has a lot of power in these conversations and is someone that sits at a very, very high table in terms of the college football and college sports world, you can't necessarily go to him if you have a specific college football problem or if you have a specific college basketball problem. You would have to go to other entities that are even more convoluted and even more confusing. So I think that's kind of been the biggest thing that I've taken away from this last little bit in college sports where everything is changing is it didn't feel like we had much of a real crystalline structure before. It felt like we had a lot of people with a lot of titles next to their names, but not a lot of connection between all of those groups and a lot of cohesion between all of the things that need to be together if they're going to move forward and be a viable way to kind of police and govern college sports going forward. So it'll be really, really interesting to watch, but it sounds like he is in favor of something just a little bit different, possibly breaking off the Power Four and kind of allowing them to govern themselves, to create their own rules in terms of the transfer portal, in terms of NIL, the house settlement, everything in between. They can kind of decide how they want to handle that on their own. And I assume that there would be some type of tie to the NCAA in some way, but for the most part, these four conferences would just kind of stand alone and be able to operate on their own. And obviously, this is going to cause a ton of different, hurdles and a ton of different issues on the back end of this. Like someone that was talking about this said, essentially, you're creating two different Division Ones, and that hasn't happened, obviously, since the FCS broke off, but it could happen once again, where you have the Power Four, and then you have the Group of Five, and then you have the FCS. So that's kind of the way that, frankly, I've seen this going for quite some time, and I think a lot of people have seen this going for quite some time. So that's obviously going to be a huge topic of conversation, but it has to get through a huge council up in the NCAA, and it's not necessarily leaned towards the Power Four conferences quite as much as a lot of the other stuff in the sport is. Only 14 of the 40 members in that council are Power Four from the Power Four conferences, and that could lead to kind of this getting shut down before it really gets started. So that would be a very, very interesting thing to watch. And I think when you look throughout all of these different updates that have kind of happened in the last 18 months, it feels like we're kind of speed running through all of the big time changes that probably should have been happening for about 2 decades at this point, if I'm being totally honest. But I do think it's going to be really, really interesting because now the Power Four is kind of in a situation where maybe they have to appeal to some of the smaller conferences and try to get them to push this through because, frankly, I do think it's something that is kind of the path of least resistance in a certain sense. I do think there is a certain way where the NCAA can govern these smaller schools and can do a good job there. But some of these bigger schools are just kind of too hard to corral. They're too hard to kind of handle, and you don't really know where to start because you're playing with two totally different entities when you move from the Group of Five to the Power Four. So I think that's kind of the biggest thing is this is an answer. This is a way forward, and frankly, I think it's probably the way forward that a lot of people would be on board with pretty quickly. But at the same time, I think it would cause some problems, like possibly the Group of Five conferences being diminished that much more, and especially the TV dollars that would come into these two different entities would be on different stratospheres. The Group of Five would essentially dry up pretty quickly because if you're ESPN, and especially if those four conferences build out even more, you're not going to be very interested in the Sun Belt or in the American if you can get more of the Big 12 or you can get more of the SEC or the Big 10 or the ACC. So I think that's the biggest thing here is that would be a way forward. And that would definitely be something that I think could happen. I think it could get pushed through and really have not too much resistance. I think the group of 5 schools would be a little bit worried, but I think this is a way forward. I just think it's one that's a little bit more dangerous. So overall, I would love to see the major 10 conferences, including the Pac-12, kind of stick together, have a way to keep them intact, but that's harder to pull off than it is to say, obviously. That is something that, with the gap that is forming, especially financially, between the big dogs and everyone else, it makes it that much harder to kind of create a way forward that makes sense for everyone. And I think that's the biggest thing here, where the Power Four should be operating differently than the Group of 5 moving forward. I think most of us can agree on that. I think there is certain rules that could go, national and absolutely dominate and be the end-all be-all for every single team, but at the end of the day, Texas is playing a different game than JMU, and that's just the reality of the sport at this point. So splitting them up is not necessarily the worst idea in the world to me. But also, there's another idea out there, which I tend to believe is probably the better way forward, and it goes back to what we were talking about earlier on in the segment, which is possibly just have each sport be their own entity. And maybe you keep the Olympic sports and some of the other sports under the umbrella of the NCAA, but college football should not be governed, should not be treated the same way as volleyball or as softball. And it's not that those two sports should not get the love that they deserve, because they absolutely should, but it's just to say it's two totally different entities. It's two totally different things that absolutely work in different area codes. It's something that I think we've all seen kind of happening, and it's been the case for quite some time, but I think there's a world where maybe you have a college football commissioner and you have a college basketball commissioner and you have a commissioner of pretty much every sport in under the NCAA umbrella, and they all kind of report to the same office, or at least they have an office that kind of bridges the gap between, the Power Four or these specific sports and everyone kind of coming together. So maybe you have some ADs that are a part of a structure that just kind of makes everything crystalline in the interior, and then you can kind of let the specific sports, the commissioners of each sport kind of handled it on a case-to-case basis. And I think that's likely the best way forward, because college football faces different challenges than college basketball, and they face different challenges than college baseball and softball and volleyball and on and on. So I think we need people that are just more specialized in these things, that are just, we are college football people, we are college basketball people, we are college softball people, and there are those people in the NCAA umbrella. I just don't think there's enough of them. I think there has to be more people that are very, very honed in on a sport, and I don't necessarily think it would only help, college football. I think it would help every single sport, because as of right now, when you look across the landscape of college sports right now and you see some of the different decision makers, they don't really have a huge incentive to lean towards the smaller sports, to throw them a bone and keep them alive in media deals and things of that nature. If you have a group of people that are totally dedicated to making sure that sport is dealt with and handled and respected the way that it should be, then that opens the door to possibly it being a little bit better of a product and you getting a little bit more money. And obviously, there are hurdles there. There will definitely be hurdles with the TV contracts. But at the end of the day, having people that are walking into that room saying, I don't care about college football right now. I don't care about college basketball right now. I care about college softball. I care about college volleyball. I think that actually matters. And I think that's something that, frankly, just isn't happening enough in the NCAA level. So these are all very, very interesting ideas. There's no two ways about that. And it would kind of be so-called federated system. You'd have kind of this one central power, sort of, but you would also have a ton of different entities that are handling their own business on their own time and handling it the way they see fit, because they know it better than anyone else. So the way I've kind of viewed the NCAA for quite some time now is a group of people that, if you gave them the amount of resources and knowledge and everything in between that they needed, could do a very good job governing all the sports. I think there is a reality where the NCAA can get a handle on all of these sports and do it all under the same umbrella. The issue is, I think they just waited too long. I think if that were going to happen, it probably would have happened a decade ago. We would have a college football commissioner, and we would be setting up things for college football or for college basketball in totally different ways. So I think that's something that I'd love to have a college football commissioner. I'd love to have someone like Nick Saban possibly up there, although I think he's more than happy with the money that he's making in media and probably would not take that job. But at the end of the day, I think when you look at all of this, and it was something that Josh Pate was talking about, who is another great option for college football commissioner, as he is so said. But I think he was talking about it, and he said there would be just too many people that would have to give up power for this to happen. There would be too many people to say, yeah, we don't fully understand what we're doing in the world of college football. Maybe someone else should take over. And that is not something that these people do very often. If you've followed this stuff for any amount of time, you've realized these are very prideful people. And it would be very, very tough for them to say, yeah, we'll cede a little bit of money. We'll give up a little bit of power for the good of the sport and for the good of college sports in general. So it's something that I'd love to see, frankly, because I think it's the best way forward. I think it gives us a person to look at in every single sport and say, that's the guy. We don't just all have to look at Charlie Baker and ask, who's the person we should be mad at during this time? We can look at someone up at the very top and say, you're in charge of college football, you're in charge of college basketball, you're in charge of college baseball. And I think it would just make things so much more streamlined in terms of everyone, in terms of fans understanding what's going on in their sport. And also, I think it would just make everything easier when you talk about the behind the scenes stuff. You wouldn't have to fight through so much red tape to get to progress. And that's obviously where we all want to get to, is just stability. At the end of the day, we want to get to a place where we understand what the rules are, we understand what our sport is, and we can move forward from there. But at the end of the day, I think a lot of things would have to happen for this to happen and for what I want to happen, if I'm being totally honest. Because if I had it my way, I would split all of these sports. I would make sure that they were all covered by specific people and they would go off and they would do their business. But that's not necessarily the reality that we're working in, and there's definitely some contracts that would make that relatively tough. But it's obviously a very, very interesting thing, and if the NCAA president is pushing for it, then you'll likely hear from it again. So we'll unpack that as it kind of develops a little bit more. But next, I want to get into something that was kind of one of the more under-talked about biggest changes going into this year, and that's helmet communication. That's something that we've unpacked a little bit on here, but I really want to get into it because SEC Media Days had a ton to say about it. So we'll unpack all of that right after this, so stick with us.